My heart was racing as I read the email from my old friend Alex. He was inviting me and a group of our mutual friends to spend a weekend at his family's cabin in the woods. It had been years since we had all been together, and I was eager to catch up with everyone. But as I read further, my excitement turned to unease. Alex mentioned that the cabin had a history of paranormal activity, including ghostly apparitions and unexplained noises. I had never been one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but something about Alex's email made my skin crawl. I called Alex to express my concerns, but he laughed them off. He assured me that the cabin was perfectly safe and that any ghost stories were just local folklore. He promised that we would have a great time and that the weekend would be filled with good food, good drinks, and good company. Despite my reservations, I agreed to go. I was curious about the cabin's history and figured that it couldn't hurt to spend a weekend in the woods with some old friends. As the weekend approached, I found myself growing increasingly nervous. What if there really were ghosts in the cabin? What if we were in danger? But I pushed those thoughts aside and tried to focus on the excitement of the weekend ahead. I packed my bags and set off on a long drive to the cabin, ready to face whatever lay ahead. As we drove down the winding dirt road that led to the cabin, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows across the road, and the silence was oppressive. We finally arrived at the cabin, and I was struck by its rustic charm. The wood-paneled walls and exposed beams gave it a cozy, welcoming feel. Alex greeted us with a big smile, and we all settled in, unpacking our bags and making ourselves at home. Despite my reservations, the first night at the cabin was uneventful. We sat around the fire, reminiscing about old times and catching up on each other's lives. We drank beer and whiskey and laughed until the early hours of the morning. But as we all retired to our rooms for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin was old, and every creak and groan seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my heart racing at every sound. I finally drifted off to sleep, only to be awoken a few hours later by the sound of shuffling footsteps outside my door. My heart pounding, I sat up in bed and strained to listen. But the sound had stopped, and there was only silence. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but as the weekend wore on, strange things continued to happen. Doors would open and close on their own, objects would move inexplicably, and there was a constant feeling of being watched. Despite my growing fear, I tried to convince myself that there was a rational explanation for everything. But as the weekend drew to a close, I couldn't deny the fact that something was not right in the cabin in the woods. On the second night of our stay, Alex suggested that we try to contact any spirits that might be lingering in the cabin. He brought out a Ouija board, and we all gathered around the table, our fingers resting lightly on the planchette. At first, nothing happened. We asked simple questions, but the planchette remained still. I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Maybe there were no spirits after all. But then, slowly but surely, the planchette began to move. It spelled out answers to our questions, and we all stared in awe and fear. The spirit claimed to be a former owner of the cabin, a man who had died in the woods surrounding the property. He told us that he was angry and resentful, and that he didn't want us there. As the session continued, the atmosphere in the room grew tense. The spirit's responses became more aggressive, and the planchette began to move faster and faster. Suddenly, the planchette shot off the board and flew across the room. We all jumped back in shock, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. What had we unleashed? We decided to end the session, but the damage had already been done. The cabin felt different, almost hostile. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stirred up something dangerous, and that we were no longer welcome in this place. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every sound made me jump, and I felt like I was being watched. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, until I finally drifted off into an uneasy sleep. But then, in the middle of the night, I was awoken by a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a tall, shadowy figure with no discernible features. It didn't move or make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even scream. I felt like I was suffocating, like the shadow figure was draining the life out of me. Finally, after what felt like hours, the figure disappeared. I lay in bed, shaking and crying, until the morning light finally crept in through the window. I tried to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. The shadow figure felt real, and its presence lingered in the cabin, even after it had disappeared. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened, not wanting to scare them or make them think that I was losing my mind, but I couldn't deny the fact that something was terribly wrong in this place. The cabin was no longer a cozy getaway, but a place of fear and dread. The next morning, one of our group members was missing. We searched the cabin and the surrounding woods, but there was no sign of him. As the hours passed, panic set in. We realized that we were completely isolated, with no way to call for help. Our phones had no signal, and we were too far from civilization for anyone to hear our cries for help. The atmosphere in the cabin grew even more tense as we searched for our missing friend. We couldn't help but wonder if the spirit we had contacted with the Ouija board was responsible for his disappearance. As the day wore on, we grew more and more desperate. We searched every inch of the cabin, but there was no sign of our friend. We even ventured out into the woods, calling his name and listening for any response. As the sun began to set, we realized that we were running out of time. We needed to find our friend before nightfall, or risk spending another night in this haunted cabin. Just as we were about to give up hope, we heard a faint cry for help. We followed the sound and found our missing friend, injured and disoriented but alive. We never found out what happened to him or what caused his disappearance. But from that moment on, we knew that we had to get out of that cabin as soon as possible before it claimed any more of us. Despite our friend's mysterious disappearance, we decided to stay one more night in the cabin. We didn't want to leave without answers, and we still had hope that we could find some sort of explanation for the strange occurrences that had been happening. But as the sun set on our final night in the cabin, we knew that we had made a mistake. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and we could feel the weight of something dark and malevolent bearing down on us. We tried to distract ourselves with games and conversation, but the tension was palpable. Every creak and groan of the old cabin felt like a warning, and we knew that we were not alone. As the night wore on, things only grew worse. Shadows danced across the walls, and strange noises echoed through the cabin. We could feel a presence watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. We tried to stay awake, not wanting to give in to the fear that was threatening to overwhelm us. But one by one, we fell asleep, unable to fight off the exhaustion and the terror any longer. And that's when it happened. I woke up to the sound of a blood-curdling scream, and I knew that something had gone terribly wrong. As I stumbled out of bed and into the main room, I saw that one of our group members was being dragged across the floor by an invisible force. We all sprang into action, trying to pull our friend back from the grasp of whatever was attacking her. But it was like trying to fight against the wind, and we were no match for the entity that had taken hold of her. In the end, we managed to break the hold of the ghostly presence, and we were finally able to escape from the cabin. But we left with more questions than answers, and the memory of that final night still haunts me to this day. After our harrowing experience in the haunted cabin, we were all left reeling. We had narrowly escaped with our lives, but we were forever changed by what we had witnessed. We tried to go on with our lives as normal, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us back from the cabin. We all experienced strange occurrences in our homes, and we could feel a presence lurking in the shadows. We tried to rationalize what had happened, convincing ourselves that it was all just a hallucination or a trick of the mind. But deep down, we knew the truth. One by one, we began to seek out answers. We visited psychics, mediums, and paranormal investigators, desperate to find some sort of explanation for the horrors we had experienced. But no one could give us the answers we were looking for. Some told us that the cabin was cursed, while others said that we had brought the entity with us when we left. In the end, we realized that we would never truly be free from the haunted cabin. We would always carry the memory of that night with us, and the fear that we felt would never truly leave us. We learned to live with the knowledge that there are some things in this world that we may never understand. And we learned to be grateful for every day that we wake up alive, knowing that we had narrowly escaped the clutches of a malevolent force that sought to do us harm. The haunted cabin may be nothing more than a distant memory now, but the lessons we learned here will stay with us forever. As we tried to move on from the haunted cabin, we couldn't help but think about our friend who had disappeared. We had never found any trace of her, and we were left with more questions than answers. We visited the local authorities and asked for their help in finding her, but they told us that there was nothing they could do. They had searched the area around the cabin, but they had found no evidence of foul play or any indication of what might have happened to her. We were devastated by her loss, and we struggled to come to terms with the fact that we may never know what happened to her. We spent countless hours searching online and talking to anyone who might have information about her disappearance, but our efforts proved futile. In the aftermath of her passing, our lives were forever changed. We struggled to come to terms with the fact that our dear friend was no longer with us, and that we would never see her smile or hear her laughter again. The pain was almost unbearable, and yet we knew that we had to find a way to move forward. We organized a memorial service in her honor, gathering all of her friends and loved ones together to pay our respects. It was a beautiful and poignant event, filled with tears and laughter as we shared our favorite memories of her. In those moments, we were reminded of just how much she had meant to us, and how lucky we were to have had her in our lives. Despite our efforts to find closure, however, her absence continued to haunt us in ways we never could have imagined. We were tormented by the feeling that we could have done more to help her, that perhaps if we had acted differently or made different choices, she would still be with us today. It was a heavy burden to carry, and one that we struggled to put down. As time passed, we tried our best to move forward. We went through the motions of our daily lives, doing our best to keep her memory alive in our hearts. But even as we tried to heal, we could never forget the pain of her loss. It lingered with us, like a ghostly presence that we could never quite shake. Despite our grief, however, we never lost sight of the love and friendship that had bound us together. We knew that our friend would want us to find joy in life again, to continue to laugh, and love and pursue our dreams. And so we did our best to honor her memory by living our lives to the fullest. Every time we gathered together, we raised a glass in her honor, celebrating the memories we had shared in the bond that had united us. And as the years passed, her memory became a part of the cabin's legacy, a reminder of the power of friendship and love to endure even in the face of the unknown. Though she was no longer with us, her spirit lived on in the hearts of those who loved her, a beacon of hope and light in the darkness.